Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Robert Swartwood here. Tonight, I am joined by an American short story writer whose first book, Stories for Nighttime and Some for the Day, was a selection of the Barnes& Noble Discover Great New Writers program and was named one of the 10 best fiction books of the year by Hudson Booksellers. His second collection of stories, Falling and Tales of Falling and Flying, was named a favorite book of the year by the staff of the Paris Review, not too shabby, and one of the best 50 fantasy books of all time by Esquire Magazine. That's right, it's your favorite writer of mine, Ben Loory. Ben, how the heck are you doing?
I'm all right. How are you? Thanks for
Good.
having me on.
Absolutely. I know. We were talking in the green room. Haven't seen you in quite a while. And then again, do you remember the very first time you and I actually met in person?
I remember sitting at a Chipotle with you in Pasadena, I think. I don't know if we
Right.
met before that, but that's the one I think of.
Do you know how we got to that Pasadena though?
Did I pick you up at the airport?
You did pick me up from the airport. That's right. I think at that point we had only just known each other just, online. And my short story, no, my anthology Hint Fiction had just come out. We
Right.
were doing an event at Romans in Pasadena, and I don't even know because I don't think I would have asked you. I think you had offered to pick me up from the airport, but I was like, yeah,
Sounds
that's
like
cool.
me.
And you picked me up and for whatever reason, we were like, hey, let's go to Chipotle. And at that point, here in Pennsylvania, I don't know, like they're everywhere now, but back then there weren't as many, I guess, Chipotles. There were hardly any. So my very first Chipotle experience was with you, Ben Lorry, in Pasadena, right when Hint Fiction came out. So that was, God, almost 15 years ago now, I want to say, probably. Or no, not 15 years ago. It came out in 2010. So so 14 years ago.
Beginning of an era. Glad to bring
That
you
is
aboard.
That is right, because the next year your first collection was released. But before we get to all of that good stuff, it's really hard to explain too for people who have not read you, like the type of stories you write. Because it's not like I'm meeting with some like crime horror writer because it's like, oh, it's crime horror. Your stories are they are Ben Laurie stories. I don't think you can really classify them any other way. So, and I don't know if you agree with that or not. I mean, you could probably assign a genre to them, but they're very unique. Actually, they remind me in a way of, and I think I have one of the collections around here somewhere. Um, yeah. Do you ever read? I'm sure you have. The Um, Edgar Carrot or
Very
Karat,
good.
I can't even say his
Yes.
name, but yeah, it kind of reminds me of those kinds of short stories. They're unique. We'll say that. So, do you remember the very first thing you did that you wrote that was creative?
Creative, like in my whole life, you mean?
Yeah, like I mean, like were you a kid? Were you in high school, college? I mean, at what point did you or you know what, it didn't really have to be anything that you've written. Is there anything that you maybe just created that was something, again, just unique to yourself?
Um, I mean, story-wise, I remember writing stories with my babysitter when I was little. We had this babysitter who would come over and my parents would leave, and then she'd just take my sister and I to the dining room table, and she'd say, "Okay, we're going to write a book now." And then we would start by writing a story, and we would do it one sentence at a time. We'd just go in a circle, and someone would say the first sentence, someone would say the second, and my babysitter would just write all the sentences down until we got to the end of the story. And then she would take pieces of paper and she'd write one sentence at the bottom of each page. And then we'd illustrate the story as like a picture book. And so then when my parents would get home, we'd usually have like two or three picture books that we wrote that evening. So
That's
uh,
that's pretty incredible. I don't think most babysitters kind of
yeah,
go to that length.
she was a really good babysitter. And honestly, when I look at the stories that I write now, like they're kind of similar, really, to the stories that we would write back then. I still am writing about talking animals and people flying through space and wizards and I don't know, just people having strange experiences, places, and unlikely things happening. And yeah, it's pretty much the same stuff with less illustrations.
Right. So then at what point then did you start doing it on your own? Did you start not having the babysitter there to prompt you or anyone else, where you just decided to sit down and start writing out your own stories?
No, I never did that. Yeah, I always assumed that one day I would write a book, but I never did any writing, to be honest. Like I grew up in this house where both of my parents were English teachers. And all we had was books. We didn't have a TV or anything. It was just this house full of books. And all my parents ever talked about were books. When we had dinner, my parents would come to the table and then they just kind of lecture us about literature the whole time that we were eating dinner. That was how I grew up. So I always kind of knew that books were really important, and I was always constantly reading. Like that was all there was reading books growing up. But I never did any writing on my own outside of when my babysitter came over. Then when I was in like seventh grade, we got a TV, and I never read another book for probably like 6 years after that. All I did was stare at the television until I went off to college. And it was in college when I started taking writing classes, and that was when I started writing. I want to say for real, but I don't think I was doing anything very good. It's just kind of churning out some things like I was kind of expected to do, which at the time was Raymond Carver impressions. That's what I was doing in college.
So is
And
that
at
what you
that
were
time,
reading around then? Just Raymond Carver, or who else were you reading that you would find, and maybe in retrospect, was an inspiration in terms of your writing?
I was an English major. I was like, I was an English major and I was a visual arts major, kind of side by side through college, up until senior year when I had to pick one. And so I went with visual arts because I was into film at the time. And I didn't want to write a thesis. You had to write a thesis if you went with English. Visual arts, I didn't have to do a thesis. So at the time, I was like super into Chaucer. I was kind of older English literature. I was really into Chaucer. I still love the Canterbury Tales, and I think that the Canterbury Tales are still a big influence on what I write, though probably most people don't see it that way. Um, and I read a lot of poetry. I was always into John Donne. I always liked Tennyson. Um, Yeah, and of course, Kafka was a big influence from when I first read The Metamorphosis. And then absurdist literature of all kinds. I really like the plays of UNESCO, like Harold Pinter. I love Beckett. I always loved Beckett. Um, so I feel like it's kind of these things that kind of influenced me the most was like short stories, like fables, like Aesop's fables from when I was little, mixed with the absurdity of things like Monty Python and yeah, like UNESCO was really a big influence mixed with just kind of very short, sort of folk tale-y kind of stuff, like in the Canterbury Tales. I still think that's pretty much just what I do, with some Hemingway thrown in, just in terms of simplicity of language. That was a lot.
So, do you remember the very first thing you had published?
Well, before I wrote short stories, I was a screenwriter. I went from studying film and English literature. I went off to graduate school where I got an MFA in screenwriting. And from there, I became a screenwriter, um, which is like a whole little journey that I went through it's like something from another life at this point. Um, And it was only at the end of being a screenwriter for years that I started writing short stories and immediately fell in love with writing short stories and just kind of never looked back because suddenly I found what I actually really enjoyed doing and felt like I was good at. My time as a screenwriter was mostly me being very confused and unhappy all the time and feeling like I could never really get a handle on the form, never really feeling happy with the jobs that were offered or with the things we were handing in. Um, so yeah, it was a while. I didn't publish my first short story until 2008, um, which was, I don't even want to think about the math involved. I think I was like 30, 37 or something like that. Yeah.
So going back to the screenwriting though, because I have writer friends who have done screenwriting, and I know that it's like working in Hollywood and TV, it's one of those professions where you can literally make a good living, but never have anything produced. So is that something you feel like you could have just continued doing, or was it just so soul crushing in the fact that all this stuff that you were working on just essentially probably went down to a black hole?
Well, so I wasn't working in TV because I don't have any, I'm not interested in TV. I'm a movie person. So yeah, I mean, TV, there's a lot of money in TV and there's a certain amount of job security in that there's so much of it being made all the time. They need writers, like I feel like, I don't feel like it's that hard to become a TV writer. I mean, I see people doing it all the time. Um, so yeah, I don't really know much about that world. Um, as a screenwriter for the movies, it was, I mean, it was hard for me because, to be honest, I was never interested in being a screenwriter. I was interested in getting into directing. That was the part of movies that I was interested in. So screenwriting was like the first rung on what I thought of as a ladder. But then very quickly along the way, I was just like, yeah, this business it's just not for me. And coming from screenwriting is just not the way that I'm going to get there. Um, Mostly, nobody has any interest in you and your ideas for original screenplays. Maybe they did at some point, and they probably do for some people, but most of it is just, hey, we want to make Flintstones 4, and now we're like trying out people who want to maybe write Flintstones 4 or whatever the thing is they want to write. And so you're just going from meeting to meeting, talking to people who want to make Flintstones 4 or whatever. I don't know, The Mask 7. And it's like cheerleading tryouts, but in order to be allowed to write the sequel to some horrible movie you don't have any interest in. And sort of getting past that to a place where you can actually even try out to get jobs doing something you're interested in is it's just it's just really hard.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
speaking of Flintstones, I remember I think back on Twitter I threw out the idea about doing a reboot of the Flintstones, but kind of by way of The Sopranos, so very dark, gritty Flintstones. I still think there's something there.
Yeah.
All right, so 2008, was that when you said you had your first thing published?
Yeah.
At that point, how many, and then do you remember like what story or what had been published in 2008? And do you remember where it was published?
First story I had published was called, there were actually two that were published at the same time. The first was called The Greatest Thief in the World, and the second was called, oh, what was it called? Toward the Earth. Toward the Earth ended up in my second collection, Tales of Falling and Flying. Greatest Thief in the World, I've still been working on because I never give up on a story. And it's finally done, and it's in the new collection that I have now that we're shopping around. They were published in a magazine called Knock magazine out of Seattle. It was like Antioch University in Seattle. And the reason it was published was because a friend of mine, the novelist Jonathan Evison, though I don't think he'd been published by that point. I don't think his first novel, All About Lulu, came out until a year later, maybe. But Jonathan, was asked to guest edit an issue of Antioch. And so he asked me for a story, and he published those two stories. That was the first time. I started writing stories in 2004. So it was like 4 years of writing stories before I even started sending them out. Um, and that was the first time anyone published them.
Now, your style, again, I mentioned before, it's very unique. I can't really just compare it to any other writers at least off the top of my head. How long did it take you to develop that style? Because I'm assuming probably right out of the gate that might not have been a style that you had perfected. Because you had said, I think before that initially in college, a lot of it was just, Raymond Carver type stories that you were writing. At what point did you get to a place where you were writing again the quote unquote Ben Loory style of story?
Well, it all happened by accident. I mean, it evolved after it happened by accident, but it pretty much came not exactly fully formed, but close to. So what happened was, when I was a screenwriter, I had a writing partner. I'm going to try and tell this story in the short form because it's a very long story. But so when I was a screenwriter, I had a writing partner. He was a friend of mine from film school, and we started writing screenplays together. And from the beginning, we had very, very different taste, like totally opposite taste in everything. I don't even know what we were doing, but he was like just someone who was interested in drama. Like his favorite movie was The English Patient. And I, at the time, and still to a certain extent, was someone who was only interested in two things: horror and comedy. That was it. Like I don't have any interest in anything that doesn't scare me or make me laugh. Um, so we had some trouble in this screenwriting partnership because we could never even agree on like what kind of jobs we were trying to get, because anything I was interested in, he was not interested in, and vice versa. I remember one time they came and they asked us if we wanted to write the new Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. I was like, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened in my life. Absolutely yes. And my writing partner was like, absolutely not. No, like so we had some trouble navigating the differences.
How
I
did you
could,
wait? How did you guys, being so different in terms of taste, how did you guys get linked up as writing partners?
oh man, so I mean, we were friends. We were both in the screenwriting program. I mean, yeah, I don't know, like we would hang out at lunchtime. We weren't in the same classes. We would just kind of hang out at lunchtime and talk about stuff. He was smart. He was funny. Strange because he had no interest in writing funny, but he was funny and he's very smart. He just didn't value that. And what happened is after we graduated, he sold a screenplay as a pitch to a company. It was actually Jodie Foster had a production company for a little while, which I think she very quickly decided she didn't want to do that. But for a while, she had a production company, and so my friend sold her company this screenplay as a pitch. Like he just went in there and told them the story, and they were like, "Yes, we will hire you to write this as a screenplay and do what, two drafts and a polish." Um, so then he went off to write it, and he was having trouble writing it. Like he always had really good ideas, and he could talk a lot about stories. Um, but I guess when it like got down to it, I don't know, he got like writer's block. He just had trouble writing the damn thing. So he called me up at some point and he's like, can I come over and just talk to you about this screenplay that I'm writing because I'm having trouble with it? So he started coming over and talking to me about the screenplay and where he was having trouble, and we started talking through things, and he was still having trouble writing it. And then it was, like 2 weeks or something before it was due. He was like, I can't do it. I can't do it. Can you, can you please just help me finish this screenplay? So I was like, okay. So I, helped him finish the screenplay. And like he paid me to finish it. And then he handed it in. And when he handed it in, he put my name on it, which was not like, hey, we never talked about that. I absolutely did not think that he was going to do that. I don't know why I did it. He never asked. He just put my name on the screenplay and handed it in, which immediately created this gigantic legal nightmare because, my name was not on the contracts, but my name was on the screenplay and the screenplay had been handed in. So according to the Writers Guild, like you couldn't just take my name off. So everybody there was like really upset with me. So I had suddenly like put my name on the screenplay and was like holding them over a barrel or something. They thought I was going to sue them. It was really bad. It's a bad legal scene. I had a lot of lawyers and studio executives calling, and anyway, eventually we kind of sorted it out. But what came out of it was we became writing partners. Um, we were like suddenly I was signed on to do another draft and a polish on this screenplay, and my friend's agent and his manager were like, well, now you have your name on this thing. Like you guys should just be writing partners now because it's too confusing to everybody that now your name is on this and they don't know who wrote what. So anyway, so we became writing partners. And it was sort of fraught from the beginning because we didn't have similar tastes. So we were always kind of navigating that. The one thing we both liked was the X-Files. And that was like the place where our interests sort of met. And so that was like the one thing we kind of agreed on, and they could sort of pigeonhole us and send us to meetings for people who were doing X-Files related stuff. So that was the kind of work that we did. It's a weird niche, which probably doesn't really exist anymore, but in the late 90s, early 2000s,
Yeah.
X-Files
So
was
in retrospect, with Texas Chainsaw, he should have just had you write write the script. His name would have been on it. You both would have got paid well. Dumb move by by him, but anyway. So let's go on to your first collection, which was stories for nighttime and some for the day.
right.
Um,
Right.
I
Sorry, I didn't
know,
get to the
yeah,
point. The whole point of that story, which is so finally, after all this time, we finally stopped writing together because we couldn't stand each other. We couldn't agree on what jobs to get. You know, I'm getting to the point of like how I started writing the stories the way I did. Okay, so sorry. So finally we like broke up as a partnership because we couldn't agree on what jobs to get, and couldn't agree on anything, and just couldn't get along, and figured we'd be happier writing separately. So so I went off to become a screenwriter on my own. In order to get jobs as a screenwriter, you need a writing sample, you need a screenplay that you wrote. And it has to be something you wrote alone. You can't use something you wrote with somebody else as your writing sample because they don't know who wrote it. Like when you have a partnership on a screenplay, everybody assumes one person is like the genius and the other person is riding the coattail. Like they don't know who did what. So I had to go up and write a screenplay on my own, which I had never done since screenwriting school. Like I hadn't written a screenplay on my own, and I couldn't use the one I wrote in uh, in my MFA program because it was bad. So I was like, what am I going to write a screenplay about? I don't know. I got to come up with some ideas. So I spent some time and I just sat down and started writing what I thought were screenplay ideas. They were like treatments, is what we called them in screenwriting, like a 2 or 3 page long description of what happens in the story beginning to end. Very simply written, like, it's not like no figurative language. You're not trying to impress anybody with the writing. There's no, you know, most of the time you don't even give people names. Um, you're not writing full scenes, there's no dialogue. You're just kind of saying what happens from the beginning to the end of a story as clearly as you can. So I started doing that. I would just like, sit down, think of like the beginning of a story, write a story, get to the end, move on to the next one. I started sort of stockpiling story ideas as fast as I could, trying to find one to write a screenplay out of. And then after I'd written like maybe 20 or 30 of those, one day I sat down and I read through them and I was like, I don't know what these are, but they are not screenplay ideas. Mostly they were about like one character and they would take place either over the span of like 10 minutes or like 150 years, or they would be just like really kind of nightmarish, dreamlike stories, or they would be about talking animals, or yeah, or they'd just be very surreal, strange things that didn't really make sense. They weren't really dramas, they were just this strange thing, but I really liked them because I hadn't really read anything like them before. Like now, when I look at them, I can kind of see what I am doing or was doing. And now I look at them and I'm like, oh, these are really just sort of modern folk tales. It's kind of like Grimm's fairy tales, but with an internal conflict, like a modern short story. They take place in modern day, although often in a kind of Twilight Zone-y world. But at the time, they just seemed kind of inexplicable and strange to me, and I just loved them. So I decided I was just going to write a book of these stories, whatever they were. And in my mind, I had this little vision, which is it's like those Terry Gilliam cartoons and Monty Python, where it's like God in his little cloud, There's a voice saying, "Oh," and it was God in his little cloud, and he was holding this bright yellow book. And I was like, okay, I'm going to write this bright yellow book of 100 stories like these. And that's just suddenly became my obsession. And so then that's what I did. Is I just kind of like sat there in my house, and I just wrote and wrote these weird little stories, hundreds and hundreds of them, until I had 100 of them that I loved. And at that point, I had a book, and then I sort of went forward from there. So it all happened by accident. Like I never thought that I would write a book of short stories. I always kind of assumed at some point I would write a novel because that's what my parents always talked about. That's what people in school always told me was important. Um, I was not setting out to write stories, weird or otherwise. It just kind of happened, and then I liked it, so I kept doing it. Now
Did
it's like
you
20
ever
years
write a
later, and
short
still
story that had quotation marks in it?
no. And the quotation marks, right? That just comes out of screenwriting because when I started doing well in screenwriting, you don't use quotation marks. You indent the dialogue, whatever. But so when I started writing these stories and I would have dialogue, I just wrote the dialogue in. I didn't put in quotes because I wasn't thinking of my short stories. I didn't have character names because when you're writing a screenplay, like no one cares about the names. They always get changed. Tend to just do them at the end anyway. So I would just call them the man, the woman, the boy, the girl, the fish, the squid, whatever. I didn't describe people because in a screenplay, you don't generally spend a lot of time describing things. Like you give whatever the most important detail is, and then you leave the rest to the director's imagination, to the reader's imagination. People fill that stuff in. So you don't have any interiority because there's no interiority in the screenplay. So all the stuff that sort of defines my style just kind of grew out of screenwriting and out of what I thought were treatments that I was writing in the beginning.
Yeah. And I could see that, now that you mention it, how the stories do feel like treatments that are for film. So, all right, well, let's get to the collection because what was published, I know, is not necessarily what your initial, because you said you had 100, and I think in here it's, how many is in this one?
There's 40 in each of the books.
And 40 in each of the books. Actually, isn't this one 41 with the TV? Or
No,
is
they're
that
both, it's 39 plus the TV is
plus
40.
the TV? So tell us, okay, so you have someone you knew, I know was a friend of yours, wanted to be an agent, and she was shopping around your collection. Can you tell us about how this book came about? Because at that point, and I don't know, for people who are, I guess, watching this, you have to understand, like, what, 10, 15 years ago, there was this group of small micro press writers who were oftentimes writing these stories for these little online mags or whatever that they didn't pay anything. It just kind of was like, oh, get your story in here. You just kind of build your resume of stories, and it was all very, very, I guess, like minor league type stuff. And of course, the dream was always getting into like the Atlantic, Harper's, New Yorker, and then all of a sudden it was like, oh, Ben Loory, he has a story coming out in the New Yorker. Like what's this about? And so, can you talk about like the backstory about how that came about?
Well, there's a lot. Yeah. Okay. How do I explain this? So I left out one story when I'm explaining how I came to write the stories that I do, which is that before I started writing the stories that I think of as my stories, I wrote one other story. When I was in that period when I had to go off and write screenplay on my own, I took a class in writing short stories because I thought that if I could just, sit down and write a bunch of stories, then I could turn one into a screenplay. So I took a short story writing class and I wrote one story, which I think of as like my normal story. Most of my stories are like 800 words long, ranging up to maybe 1,300 words. But this first story that I wrote was about 4,500 words, which is like an epic to me now. Um, I wrote this story in one night. It was the first short story that I ever wrote. And in the process of writing that story, which was called The TV, although it had a different title at that time, it was called like, what was it called? I can't remember what it was. It had like a really long, almost Raymond Carver-ish title. It was like, like what we talk about when we talk about love kind of title. So I wrote that story, and in the process of writing that, I was like, oh yeah, this is like way too complicated, and I need to simplify this. I need things to be a lot clearer. Like I got to think movies, you know, not short stories. It's got to be something I can visualize all the way through, and where all the internal conflict is externalized instead of just like thought through. Um, and at that point, I started writing what I was thinking of as those treatments. That's how I got to that. So then I wrote this book of 101 stories, and that took me like 4 or 5 years. And in the process of doing that, I never sent the story out to a literary journal. I never knew literary journals existed except in some vague sort of way. I grew up, my parents subscribed to the New Yorker. The New Yorker always confused me when I would try to read those stories because those stories were not about spacemen and ghosts. I was just like, this story is about people going to dinner. I don't understand. So like the whole literary journal world was just something I never thought about. So I wrote this book of 101 stories, and when I was done, I sent it off to Melville House, which was the one place that I always knew was going to publish my book when I was done. Why Melville House? I don't know. Like I had no, when I try and understand my thinking at any point in my life. It's just beyond me. But I was obsessed with Melville House. I think number one, because I like Melville. And number two, I really liked their little logo, which is of this sort of house with an off-kilter roof. I don't know, but I just knew I was going to finish this book of 100 stories. I'm going to send it to Melville House. They were going to publish it. It was going to be this bright yellow book. And that was going to be the coming true of my dream. So I finished the book of stories. I sent it off to Melville House. A week later, they sent it back. They're like, hey, we don't publish short story collections. I was like, oh, well, there goes my dream. Like that's it, it's over. Like I just spent 5 years for nothing. Like I had no other plan. Like that was it. So then I just was sad for a while, and I was like, I don't know what to do. And then I don't even know who told me this, but somebody was like, you could probably get some of your stories published in literary journals. I was like, literary journals? Huh? What's that? So I typed literary journal into the Google box, and all these journals started coming up. I had no idea what was a good journal, what was a bad journal, like if there were good or bad, like no idea. Just started sending stuff out like blindly to whatever came up when I typed literary journal into the box. Um, and people started rejecting my stories real fast. No, we don't want this. What are you doing? I got a lot of things like that. I got a lot of responses where people like, you should probably take a class in writing short stories. Like you're just, you need to describe things. Why don't your characters have names? I can't see anything that's happening because you're not telling me what people's hair color is like. We need to have some kind of window into these characters' minds so we know what they are thinking. You don't use any figurative language. Who do you think is going to publish this? Like, people were not, people were not very nice when I first started sending stories out. And and I was like, okay, so people think I'm an idiot. Like I'm sending stories out, and sometimes I would get my stories rejected so fast that I was like, oh, they didn't even read this story. Like maybe they read like the first paragraph. Like I would literally get stories rejected the same minute that I sent them in. Like I'm not kidding, like the same timestamp minute that I would send them in, they would get rejected. I was like, I need a way to sort of explain to people that I'm not a moron and that these stories are written this way. Like I know that they're written in a specific way. And at some point I was like, oh, they're kind of written the way Aesop's fables are written. They're just like very simple and clear. It says what's happening. Like there's no bullshit about them. They're, they're just like clear and very short. And so I started calling them fables, even though they're not fables. Like they're not fables. They don't have a moral. Most of them are not about animals. Like maybe one in every 20 stories I write is about an animal. Most of them are not about animals. Um, but I started calling them fables just to sort of tell people to expect something different, you know? So they would kind of read them through a different lens. And as soon as I did that, people started accepting them. It's like, okay, I'm writing fables. I'm a writer of fables now, even though I don't write fables. So then people started accepting these fables that I was writing and publishing them in these little journals. And I did that for probably like 6 or 7 months. I mean, bear in mind, I had a pile of 101 stories that I was just sending out pretty much every day. Like if I got one rejected, I'd just send it somewhere else. It was like I was doing a lot of submitting. So I got like maybe 50, 60 of these stories published. And every time I get a story published, I'd be like, okay, so now someone's going to read my story, and then they're going to call me up and be like, oh, hey, I read your story, and we really like it, and we'd like to publish your book. I always in my bio for each of my stories, I'd say, like, I have this book of stories looking for a publisher, and nobody ever called. Nobody ever wrote me a letter saying, hey, these stories are great. We want to publish this. It's just, total silence from the publishers. I was like, shit, this isn't working. So then this friend of mine from college, who was not an agent but wanted to become an agent, asked me if she could represent my collection. And, if she sold it to someone, then I'd have a book deal and she'd become an agent. I was like, yeah, sure, go ahead, knock yourself out. Um, and she took it, and like maybe 2 months went by and nothing happened. It got rejected. Somebody rejected it. Can't remember, Riverhead, I think. Somebody rejected it. And then there was just like a lot of silence. And I was like, yeah, I don't know. My friend Sarah, maybe maybe she's not meant to be an agent. It doesn't seem to be working. Um, and then one day she called me up. She was like, okay, Ben, so I got your collection to this guy at Penguin, Josh Kendall, and he loves it. Um, but he says he can't publish a collection this weird. That was the term. Unless you've had a story in the New Yorker, Harper's, or the Atlantic. I was given three choices, and if I got a story in one of those three places, then he could publish the collection. I was like, well, I don't have a story in any of those places. She was like, well, so he knows this guy at the New Yorker, and he can send them some of the stories. So we need to pick like 5 stories from your book that we will send this guy at the New Yorker. And they had these stories that hadn't been published before, which made things difficult because I just had like 50 or 60 of like my best stories published in little journals, and you can't send them something that's already been published. So it's kind of down to, I mean, I still had stories I love, but they weren't like my shining stars. So we sent this guy at the New Yorker 5 stories. And he wrote back and he said, these are great. They're too weird, and they're way too short. We don't publish stuff that's this weird and this short. Do you have anything longer? I was like, no, that's what I write. And my agent said, what about that story about the TV that you wrote? Which, that story, I just like set it aside. It was, you know, it wasn't what I was doing. Um, yeah, I wasn't sending it out other places the way I was sending out these stories. It wasn't part of my book. I was like, yeah, they don't want that story. That story is like totally insane. And like, it's not a New Yorker story. And Sarah said, well, it's long enough. Like, what do you got to lose? So I said, okay. So I gave her that story and she sent that story to the guy at the New Yorker. And I had this spreadsheet, like I had an Excel spreadsheet where I entered every story that I sent out, the date that I sent it out, where I sent it to, etc. I'd submitted something like 800 times at that point, and that was the only story I didn't enter into my spreadsheet because it was so preposterous that we were sending this story to the New Yorker. Like, I could not believe I was like embarrassed to be sending that story to the New Yorker. So I didn't even put it in there. And like a couple weeks went by and nothing happened. And I just kept sending out my stories to little literary journals. And then one morning I was going to bed. It was like 5:30 in the morning, which was, about my time to be going to bed. And I got an email, and this email was like, "Hi Ben, we would love to publish this story. We have a couple edits. They didn't say what story it was. I was like, what is this? I don't even know." And I looked in the email address, and it was somebody at the New Yorker. I was like, wait, what's going on? Like like, somebody's messing with me. So I emailed my agent. Actually, I called her. It's like, it seems somebody sent me this email. I don't know, but it might be from the New Yorker. So I sent her to her, and anyway, it turned out it was the New Yorker, and they wanted that story. So then the New Yorker took that story, and the next day, Penguin said, "Okay, we will publish your collection," and that was how it happened. As a
Right,
result,
except they needed to have that story in the collection. And I know that that
yeah,
was a little bit of a sticking point for you.
that was yeah. They were like, yeah, they were like, yeah, you need to include that story in the collection. Why wasn't it in the manuscript? I was like, well, it's not part of this project. I was always like, it was like I was explaining it as though like one night I baked a cake, and in the process of baking this cake, I was like, yeah, like I don't know interest in making cakes. What I really want to do is become a sushi chef. And then I started making sushi, and like I made a ton of sushi that I loved and I thought was awesome. And then when I like went out to get people interested in my sushi collection, they were like, "What about that cake you made? Can you please include that cake in this collection of sushi?" And it's like, "What? Like, why would I? Like, that's like the last thing you want in a sushi collection." But so anyway, so I agreed to include that in the collection. Like, basically, my agent was like, "You have to do this. Like, you'd be insane not to take this deal. Like, they're going to publish a book. Like, let them have this one story that's been in the New Yorker." I was like, "Okay." So, so I let them do it. I still find it a little irritating, but I agree. In retrospect, it was the right choice to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, so for people who have not read it yet, stories for nighttime and some for the day. Was this the initial what was the title for the 101 stories? Was this the title? Because I know that then you kind of, this one only has not more than half of the stories that were in the initial collection.
Yeah, that was the title. It was always called Stories for Nighttime and Some for the Day, although it did have a subtitle, as though that title is not long enough. It had like a subtitle, which was 100 Stories and a Joke. Um, so yeah, yeah. So when Penguin bought the book, they said, this book would be like 600 pages long. We can't publish a book that long by a first-time writer. Book of stories that long. Like you need to cut this down. And I said, how many stories can I put in it? And they said maybe 30 or 40. So I was like, okay, 40, because I didn't know if I was ever going to be able to publish a book again. So I went with 40 and spent a lot of time figuring out which 40 and narrowing it down. And um, to be
Yes.
honest, sorry.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, you have it broken up into three parts. And then, of course, there's the appendix, which is the New Yorker story, because it doesn't, I guess it's not necessarily one of the, again, it's a little bit of a separate from the rest of the collection in terms of just the more flash fiction pieces. So, what was that process like in terms of, again, kind of culling down to 40 and then also how you put them in the three sections?
So the entire process was like a total nightmare. Um, but so getting it down from 101 to 40, that part wasn't that hard because at that time I had there were a lot of stories in there that I knew weren't quite right. Like I was still wrestling with them. Um, so the first thing I did was I just went through and I just like cut out, because I had this image that when you sold a book, that then an editor was going to sit down with you and work with you, like, like Robert Caro and his editor. They, they like sit down and they work through every story in the book, and there'd be like 2 years of editing and going back and forth. Um, so there were stories in the book that I figured that my editor would help me with. So quickly I just went through and I just like cut out those stories. And then there was a process where I went through and I looked at, well, what stories are sort of like other stories, like, I don't know. There's a story about an octopus and there's a story about a squid. So we're just going to use the octopus story and set the squid story aside, or, I don't know, anything that had any kind of blatant similarities. I kind of separated them, and I tried to include stories that were funny and balanced out with stories that were scary or that were like really sad. Um, Tried to include stories that were, about man versus stories that were woman versus stories that were children, things like that. Just tried to kind of keep things mixed. Then when I had that narrowed down, then there was this endless period where I tried to put the stories in some sort of coherent order. And that process it was just like an unending puzzle that I could not figure out. And I would put them in one order, and then there was always like something I couldn't get right. I didn't like it. I'd give them to somebody to read through. They'd say, move this one there, that one there. Then I'd read it, be like, that doesn't work because of this. It was just really hard. So finally, what I did was I just put them in chronological order when I wrote them. So that is the order they appear, because I realized that that order had a kind of, it made sense, that you could see the progression of the stories. You can see, like, when I first started writing them, they were not exactly horror stories, but they were very tense stories, kind of nightmarish stories about it's kind of like grief-stricken individuals or people in some kind of psychological distress. So often like one character like running around in a maze for a while. Then as the book progresses, you can see where other characters enter. The stories involve more people. Then at some point, there's like talking animals appear. Things get sort of wackier. They get longer. It kind of blossoms into some really surreal shit near the end, and then kind of comes out the other end. It's interesting the way it happened. Um, so in the end, I just went with like strict chronological order. With I think there's like maybe one or two stories that I moved. I don't even remember which ones they are. The three, the three sections. Yeah, I don't know. That was my editor. He was like, we should separate this into three sections. Um, I was like, okay. He's like, yeah, it'll give people like a stopping point in the reading process. I was like, okay, fine. He wanted to give the three sections names. Um, he wanted to, he actually wanted to separate the sections by theme, but I don't think in terms of theme. And it felt very strange to me to be grouping stories by theme. So we didn't do that. And I didn't really want to give them titles because it didn't really make sense to have titles. So I just called them section one, two, and three. And then because I'm always obsessed with numbers, I was like, okay, how do we divide 40 stories into three sections? It doesn't work. So we went with three sections of 13, and then had like a plus one left over. And that plus one nicely dovetailed with having to include that TV story at the end. So then
Yeah.
that just became how I structure books. So then the second book was the same way. Three sections of 13 plus one at the end. And now the third book is same thing.
So in the first book, there's an author's note. Was that in the initial draft that you were sending around, or is that before you published it, you decided to put it just says, it's a very, very short author's note. It just says, here are some stories. I hope you like them.
Yeah, that was my author's note from the start. I I hate it. I hate it when I open a book and there is like a preface or an introduction or something where the author or anyone else explains the book, or tells you something about it, or like, here's what you're getting into, or like, here's a certain lens through which I want you to read the book and think about it. Um, I just find it really annoying and intrusive and just like, why are you doing this? Like this book should speak for itself. I don't believe that people should be prepared for a book,
So, so
you
then
know,
why include any note at all?
because I believed in that. I believed in like, that was my wish for the book, that people would enjoy it. And I thought also that it would kind of introduce the book as something that, again, the way that calling the stories fables kind of let people know something going in. I felt like that said something about me as a writer. And my editor was like asking me to like explain. He wanted an introduction where I was like, okay, so I used to be a screenwriter, and then I had to come up with this and that, and then I started writing this, and that's why these stories don't have quotation marks, and that's why they don't have names for characters. He wanted me to tell people why these things were the way they were, and I just didn't want to do that. But I wanted people to get like some sense of who I was, and I felt like that kind of answered, that. I don't know if
So
that's true.
yeah, so that one comes out in 2011, and then your second collection, Tales of Falling and Flying, comes out in 2017. Um, what was the 6 year delay? Because it was the same publisher, and were those stories newer stories since that first collection, or were they also taken from that first 101? I mean, like I guess my question is, why did that second collection not come out maybe sooner?
Well, I mean, there's a couple different things that fed into that. I mean, the first one is just, yeah, everybody's like, so you had 60 stories left over from that first one. Why didn't the 60 stories come out like the next year? Um, so the first thing that happened was when I went to put together that second collection, um, when I said how I had to go through to narrow that 101 down to 40, the first thing I did was cut out the stories that I was having trouble with. When I sat down to work on getting the second collection together, what I quickly saw was that a lot of these stories that I was having trouble with, they were not coming together. Like it wasn't just that I was having trouble with them then, it was that I continued to have trouble with them. Um, my stories they are puzzles. They're puzzles. Like the time, I mean, it took me 5 years to write my first collection. Um, and that's not because it takes me a really long time to physically write the stories. They're 3 pages long. Uh, you know, I can write a story in like 20 minutes. Like that's not the problem. The problem is that every story I write is based on some sort of logical impossibility or some sort of paradox that somehow needs to be resolved, but resolved in a way that you don't see coming and that ends in an emotional release. It needs an emotional impact. So it's not just like a joke. It's not just like, hey, that's weird. So it's not easy, or at least it's not easy for me. Every story I write, it takes me 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 90 drafts sometimes to like get a story just to the point where it makes sense, just to the point where I'm like, oh, that's the story. I get it now. Um, then I then I get down to like writing it, like how do I get the sentences right? How do I get it? How do I get it to read right? How do I make it worth reading? How do I get it good? But it takes me a really long time just to figure out literally what happens beginning to end. And the stories that I thought were going to comprise the majority of that second book, they were fucking tough stories. Like, and I spent a couple years really wrestling with those stories. And at some point, I was like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I just got to write some other stories. So it took me a little while to get to the point where I was like, yeah, I can't just like clean up the leftover stories from this first book. I need to write new stories, which I had been doing too, but just not at the rate I had been writing them before. So the way it ended up was, I think maybe a third of the stories in that second book were stories that had originally been part of the first collection. But even those stories were completely rewritten for that book. Most of that book was new stuff. The second thing that happened was I spent 5 years sitting in my house writing that first book. Like I literally didn't leave my house for 5 years. Like I spent 5 years, people calling me up saying, "Hey Ben, you want to go out to this thing? You want to go do this thing? You want to go see this show? You want?" Saying, "No, I can't. I'm writing a book. It's going to be done in like 2 weeks, and then I can go out." And that 2 weeks turned into like a year, into 2 years, into 5 years. Like I didn't do anything for 5 years. I just sat in my chair and like obsessively wrote for 5 years. And when that book came out, suddenly I had to like leave my house, which I was really not used to leaving the house. You know, I could go on a whole speech here about my mental health journeys, but you know, so after that first book came out, suddenly I had to leave my house. I had to go on like, I had like a book tour. I had to go do readings. I did something like 250 readings in the year or two after that book came out. And I had fun when my friends would call me up and say, "Hey, want to go do this?" Be like, "Yeah, I want to go do that. I don't want to sit in my house. I'm really tired of sitting in my house." So there were a couple years where I was just kind of like out reading people's stories, selling my book, kind of hand selling my book, doing readings, and just kind of like traveling around and having fun. Um, so that lasted probably till like, I don't know, 2013, something like that. In 2013, I started teaching because somehow I had not become a millionaire by publishing my book of weird little stories, which was, I have to say, like a big blow to me personally. I always assume that as soon as anybody publishes a book, any book, they immediately become a millionaire and then get to do whatever they want for the rest of their life. It turned out that was not the case. Turned out that instead of that, I I was really in debt from from like traveling around. Excuse me, traveling around and reading stories to places. Anytime anyone would invite me somewhere to go read stories, I'd be like, "Yes, absolutely. I will fly on my own dime to your convention in Florida and stay in a hotel for 5 days to read my story for 10 minutes." Absolutely. The stuff added up and the $1 million did not materialize. And I was like, "Oh, shit, I got to make some money." And whereas in the old days, when I was writing screenplays, they paid you for that, you know, writing short stories, it continues to not pay well. So I realized I was not going to make a living writing short stories even after I had a book published. So at that point, I was like, "Oh, I need to start teaching classes," which I did. So then I was teaching classes, Then I was teaching more classes. Then I was just someone who taught classes and wrote stories every now and then when I had time. And that way kind of got things together for the book that came out in 2017. And that's still pretty much where I am. You know, this past summer I taught like 4 classes. It's like, I don't know, maybe someone out there is teaching 4 classes and still obsessively writing stories every day, but it's not me. So I've slowed down a lot. I have over the past, since that book came out, I've written another book of stories, which is out looking for a publisher. But that's just, I think, kind of the rate at which I'm writing now. Uh,
So, so was the second, okay, so the second book's called Tales of Falling and Flying. Do you already have a tentative title for the third book?
Third book is called How to Get to the Magic Mountain.
Okay.
How to Get to the Magic Mountain. Yeah,
And I saw here on Amazon for your first book, you had a blurb from Ray Bradbury.
I did. Yeah, that was nice. It was
How'd
a
that
good
come
day.
about?
So I live here in Los Angeles, and I have a favorite bookstore, which no longer exists, like all good things. But there's this bookstore in Glendale, which was called the Mystery and Imagination Bookshop. And I had been going to this bookshop since like 1998 or something like that, because I was obsessed with science fiction and mystery and fantasy. And this was a book for science fiction and mystery and fantasy. And I would just go to this bookstore all the time because I love books and they had like everything, everything. It was, I mean, it was a used bookstore, but they had every science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And there's a leaf blower guy outside. Are you hearing that?
That's fine.
No. Okay. So I'm gonna have to move closer to my microphone. But so I became friends with people who ran this bookstore in Glendale, and I would go up there all the time and hang out with the people. And they were friends with Ray Bradbury. Um, I don't know how they became friends with him, but they were like lifelong friends with Ray Bradbury. And at that time, Bradbury was very old and he was blind, or at least his vision was so bad that he could not see anymore. And and the lady around the bookstore would go and read to him because he couldn't read anymore. And so one day she read him my book and he liked it, and I can't remember exactly what he said, but it's the thing that's the blurb on my book. This guy can write, I think is what it was. Um, so he said that to the lady in the bookstore, and then when I was in the bookstore the next time, she told me the story, and she said, and he said this. He said, "Well, this guy can write,"
And then you nearly fell over.
and I was like, "Whoa, that's amazing." And then when I was talking to my agent on the telephone, I told her that story, and she was like, "Ben, shut up and listen. Tomorrow, you go back to the bookstore and you ask that lady to ask Ray Bradbury if you can use that as a blurb." I was like, I can't do that. That's rude, It's just being nice, whatever. She was like, no, Ben, you have to do this. Like, you have to do this. You cannot say no. You have to do this or I'll never speak to you again. I was like, okay. So I told me, told told the lady at the bookstore, I asked her if she thought he would mind. If anyways, she was like, no, I'm sure he'd be delighted. So she went and asked him, and he said yes. And then we had to go through all this like legal stuff with the people who like kind of control basically the people who make sure he's not being taken advantage of because he was old. But everybody agreed and was really nice about it. And that's how we got blurb on my book.
That's
It was a
amazing.
good day, I have to say. Like I literally just I went for a walk and then I just like had a total breakdown where I was just like sobbing on the sidewalk by my house because I got a blurb from Ray Bradbury. That was probably the last time I've had like a absolute collapse in public. But it was a good one. I feel like that's a good way. It's a good way to
Yeah.
have.
Yeah, and I think it's also a great way to end our little interview here. Until next time, the first stories or the first collection stories for nighttime and some for the day.
All right, here's the
Second
second.
collection. Oh, Ben has it there because my copy is hiding somewhere. But yeah, Tales of Falling and Flying. There's also a picture book, which I don't think we have time to get into right now, but we'll have to save that for next time. Oh, there it is, the baseball player and the walrus. Love it.
Yeah.
And then obviously Ben has stories everywhere. I mean, he's published over 100 of them, so I'm sure you could just Google his name, short stories, find them. A lot of them are online. But Ben, where are some good places to find you right now? Where can people check you out?
Well, my website, benlorry.com, two O's, Loory. Let's see. My most recent story was in R&R, which is a journal. That was a story about George Washington, the true story of George Washington and the cherry tree. Probably find that if you type it into the Google box. I'm also on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Yeah, I'm around.
Excellent. So again, the author is Ben Loory. The the work is hundreds of short stories, probably hundreds and hundreds that none of us will ever get a chance to read, but he keeps writing them, and they are one of a kind, absolutely. So Ben, I appreciate you taking the time tonight to hang out, and yeah, we'll see you next time. Bye.